I need to get this down while the memory is still vivid, before the therapy or the meds start to blur the edges of what happened. You hear people say that all the time on channels like this, that they need to tell their story. I used to think it was just a dramatic opener. I get it now. I'm writing this because if I don't, I might convince myself it was just a hallucination. And if I do that, I might be stupid enough to go back. It started 3 weeks ago. I'm an urban explorer, have been for about a decade. I've done the drain tunnels in Vegas, the abandoned Soviet bunkers in Estonia, you name it. But the holy grail for guys like me in the Pacific Northwest has always been Blackwood Creek. If you grew up in Washington, you know the rumors. In '84, the government seized the land via eminent domain, citing unstable soil and potential landslides. They gated the logging roads, fenced off the perimeter, and let the forest swallow the town whole. But on the forums, the rumor was always different. People said the soil didn't move, but the people did. They said entire families vanished overnight. I parked my Jeep about 6 miles from the official perimeter fence, hiding it under a canopy of low-hanging hemlock branches. I didn't want a ranger spotting it and waiting for me to hike back out with a hefty fine. I grabbed my pack, Canon R5, 3 lenses, a tactical flashlight, bear spray, and enough water for 2 days, and started the trek. The first thing that hit me was the silence. Usually these forests are loud. You've got the wind in the canopy, the chatter of squirrels, the distant call of ravens. But the closer I got to the exclusion zone, the quieter it got. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, pressurized silence, like the air itself was holding its breath. By the time I reached the chain-link fence, the only sound was the wet crunch of my boots on decades of pine needle decay. The fence was formidable, 8 feet high, topped with rusted razor wire, but explorers are persistent. About a half-mile east along the barrier, I found what I was looking for, a section where a fallen tree had crushed the top rail, creating a small, jagged opening. I squeezed through, snagging my jacket on a barb, and dropped onto the forbidden side. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The air smelled different here, stagnant, metallic, like copper and wet rot. I checked my GPS. The town center was another 3 miles in. The old logging road was barely visible, just a scar in the ferns that hadn't quite healed. I started walking, snapping photos as I went. The lighting was perfect for horror photography. Overcast, gray, with wisps of fog curling around the tree trunks like spectral fingers. About an hour in, I found the first structure. It wasn't part of the town yet. It looked like an old checkpoint or a way station for the logging trucks. It was a small wooden shack slumping to the left, the roof half collapsed under a carpet of moss. I approached it slowly. "Hello?" I called out, mostly out of habit. My voice sounded flat, instantly absorbed by the trees. I stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned, soft and spongy under my weight. I pushed the door open. It wasn't locked. The hinges just screamed in protest, a high-pitched shriek that made me wince. Inside, it was typical abandonment. Papers scattered on the floor, turned into pulp by the humidity, a rusted filing cabinet, a desk with a calendar on the wall, October 1984. I took a few shots, focusing on the texture of the peeling paint and the way the light filtered through the dirty glass. I was about to leave when I saw it. In the corner of the room, furthest from the door, there was a metal bucket. It looked out of place because it wasn't rusted. It was galvanized steel, relatively shiny. I walked over and kicked it gently. It was heavy. I looked inside and felt my stomach drop. It was full of dead birds. Robins, sparrows, a jay, maybe 10 or 12 of them. But they weren't rotting. They were fresh. Their eyes were still glassy, feathers unruffled. And they weren't just thrown in there. They were arranged, beaks pointing inward, forming a perfect spiral. I froze. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe a cat? A fox? No. Animals eat what they kill. They don't collect things. They don't make patterns. I backed out of the room, my grip tightening on the bear spray. I scanned the tree line through the broken window. Nothing but gray trunks and ferns. But the feeling of isolation was gone. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, prickling with that primal electricity that tells you you're being hunted. I stepped back out onto the porch, intending to turn around and head back to the fence. Screw the town. This was wrong. That's when I heard it. From deep inside the shack I had just exited, from the very corner where the bucket sat, came the sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a rat. It was the distinct, wet click of a tongue. Click, click, followed by a long, sharp intake of breath, like someone smelling the air. I hadn't been alone in that room.
I didn't stick around to ask who was there. I didn't even turn on my flashlight despite the gloom under the canopy. I just bolted. I sprinted off the porch, bypassing the trail entirely and crashing straight into the dense ferns. Panic makes you stupid. It makes you clumsy. I was tearing through waist-high bracken, tripping over hidden roots, my camera bag slamming against my spine with every stride. I didn't stop until my lungs were burning so bad I thought I'd pass out. I dove behind the trunk of a massive fallen cedar, pressing my back against the rotting bark, chest heaving, trying to stifle the sound of my own breathing. I gripped the bear spray so hard my knuckles turned white, waiting for the sound of footsteps, waiting for the snap of twigs. But there was nothing, just that same oppressive silence. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, listening. My brain started doing that thing where it tries to rationalize the irrational. It was a drifter, I told myself, just some homeless guy squatting in the exclusion zone. He was probably more scared of me than I was of him. It made sense, sort of, but it didn't explain the birds. A homeless guy doesn't arrange fresh roadkill in a geometric spiral. That's ritualistic. That's psychotic. I checked my GPS. In my panic, I'd veered way off the logging road. I was now deep in a section of the woods marked as Survey Sector 4, about a mile from the town limits. If I wanted to get out, I had two choices: backtrack past the shack, which was absolutely not happening, or cut a wide arc through the woods to intercept the road further up, closer to the town. It sounds insane now, I know. I should have just called the rangers, paid the fine, and went home. But the sun was still up, I had a weapon, and frankly, I was embarrassed. I convinced myself that if I just kept moving, I'd be fine. I started bushwhacking north. The terrain here was difficult, steep ravines and thick undergrowth. About 20 minutes in, I caught a flash of color in the sea of gray and green. Bright orange. I froze, crouching low. Orange doesn't occur naturally in a pine forest. I crept closer, using the noise of a nearby stream to mask my footsteps. As I got nearer, the shape resolved into a tent. It was set up in a small depression between two boulders, hidden from almost any angle unless you were right on top of it. It wasn't 1980s canvas either. It was a modern, high-end mountaineering tent. The rainfly was flapping loosely in the breeze. "Hello?" I whispered. No answer. I walked into the clearing. The air here smelled sour. Not the metallic smell from the shack, but something earthier, like wet dog and unwashed clothes. I reached the tent and saw the damage. The fabric hadn't been unzipped, it had been slashed. 3 parallel tears ran down the side, forcing the nylon open like a jagged wound. I shined my flashlight inside. It was a mess. A sleeping bag had been pulled out and dragged into the mud. Cooking gear was scattered everywhere. But it was the notebook that caught my eye. It was a rigorous waterproof field journal, lying open near the entrance. I picked it up with a shaking hand. The first few pages were standard hiker stuff, mileage logs, weather notes, sketches of plants. The dates were from 2 months ago. 2 months. Nobody had been reported missing in this area recently. I flipped toward the end. The handwriting, which had been neat and precise, started to deteriorate. The entries became erratic, scrawled in heavy charcoal pencil. September 14th. Found the tracks again. Too long to be a bear. Bipedal? September 15th. It took my boots. Why did it take my boots? September 16th. No sounds. No birds. It mimics them. I heard a jay today, but the rhythm was wrong. It was repeating the same call, over and over. A loop. My blood ran cold. It mimics them. I dropped the journal and backed away. That's when I noticed the other thing in the clearing.
About 10 feet behind the tent, suspended from a low-hanging branch, was a GoPro. It was rigged up with duct tape pointing directly at the tent's entrance, a trail cam setup. I walked over to it. The little red light wasn't blinking, but the screen on the back was intact. I hit the power button. Surprisingly, it had juice. It booted up, showing the last recorded file. I pressed play. The video was night vision, grainy and green. It showed the tent exactly as it was now, but zipped up. The timestamp was 3 a.m. 3 days ago. For the first minute, nothing happened, just the wind shaking the trees. Then, from the right side of the frame, something moved. It was slow, low to the ground. At first, I thought it was a person crawling on all fours, but the limbs bent wrong. The elbows came up too high like a cricket's legs. It crept towards the tent, silent as smoke. It stopped right in front of the camera. The lens couldn't focus on it properly. It was just a pale, blurry mass. But I saw it reach out. A hand, pale, with fingers that looked like they had too many joints, reached towards the tent fabric. Then the audio on the camera picked up a sound. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a scream. The thing spoke. It spoke in a voice that sounded like a distorted, scratchy recording. It said, clear as day, "Hello, is anyone there?" It was my voice.
My brain short-circuited. I stared at the tiny screen, the digital green glow illuminating the terror in my eyes. It was my voice. But that was impossible. The timestamp said 3 days ago. I hadn't even been in the state 3 days ago. I replayed the audio, holding the speaker right up to my ear. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The cadence, the pitch, the slight upward inflection on "there." It was identical to how I'd called out at the shack an hour ago. A wave of nausea hit me. There were only 2 explanations. One, I was losing my mind, suffering from some kind of psychotic break induced by isolation. 2, the thing on the screen wasn't just mimicking sounds. It was pulling them from where? The future? The air? Or maybe it had been stalking me long before I reached the shack, recording me from the tree line at the fence, and the timestamp on this camera was just wrong because the battery had died and reset. I didn't want to find out which one it was. I popped the SD card out of the GoPro, shoved it into my pocket, and left the camera where it hung. I needed to move. The campsite, once a sign of human presence, now felt like a dinner plate. I was standing in the middle of a feeding ground. I abandoned stealth. I scrambled up the ravine, grabbing onto exposed roots and wet stones, slipping in the mud, desperate to get back to the logging road. The woods felt tighter now. The trees seemed to lean in. Every rustle of a fern sounded like that wet, clicking tongue. When my boots finally hit the gravel of the main road, I didn't stop. I kept a brisk pace, my flashlight beam cutting a cone through the deepening fog. The sun was dipping below the tree line, and the gray light of the Pacific Northwest was fading into a bruised purple. 10 minutes later, the trees broke. I had reached Blackwood Creek. It was more intact than I expected. Usually 40 years of rot flattens a place, but the structures here were built tough, logging money. The main street was lined with brick storefronts and sturdy wooden houses, but the forest was reclaiming them aggressively. Massive moss drifts covered the roofs like thick green blankets. Ferns grew out of shattered second-story windows. I walked down the center of the street, my camera raised, documenting the decay despite the shaking of my hands. I passed a Ford Bronco with flat tires, entirely consumed by blackberry brambles. I passed a diner with the menu still painted in the window. Special, meatloaf, $3.50. It was a ghost town in the truest sense, but it wasn't empty. As I passed the old general store, I saw them. Clothes. They were everywhere. Piles of raincoats, jeans, flannel shirts, and rubber boots. They weren't packed away or discarded in a dumpster. They were laid out on the street, on the porches, on the hoods of cars. And they weren't just piles. They were arranged to look like people.
A set of overalls and a plaid shirt sat on a bench, arms folded, legs crossed. A dress and a cardigan lay on the sidewalk, positioned as if someone had just collapsed and vaporized, leaving the fabric behind. I walked up to the person on the bench. The clothes were stiff with grime, filled with dead leaves and pine needles to give them volume. I poked the chest of the flannel shirt with the barrel of my flashlight. It crunched. It was a mannequin made of refuse. A decoy. Why? To make the town look inhabited from a distance? Or was this some kind of cargo cult behavior from whatever lived in the mines? I was so focused on the leaf man that I didn't hear the movement at first. It came from inside the general store, behind me. A soft, rhythmic thump, drag, thump, drag. I spun around, raising my camera. The windows of the store were dark, covered with decades of grime. The door was slightly ajar. I held my breath. Thump, drag. It was coming from inside the aisles. I should have run. I know that. But the explorer in me, the idiot with the camera, took over. I needed to see. I needed proof. I stepped onto the porch of the general store. The floorboards whined. I pushed the door another inch. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the metallic smell of the shack or the wet dog smell of the tent. It was sweet, sickeningly sweet, like rotting fruit and cheap perfume. I aimed my flashlight into the gloom, rows of rusted shelves, cans of beans that had exploded years ago. And there, at the end of the center aisle, facing away from me, was a figure. It was wearing a yellow raincoat. It was standing perfectly still. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I held my breath. "Turn around." The figure didn't move, but a sound came from it. Not a voice. It was the sound of a camera shutter. Click, whir, click, whir. My camera shutter. The exact sound of my Canon R5. The figure in the yellow raincoat slowly began to turn, and as it did, the yellow hood slipped back. There was no head.
I didn't scream. I think I was too confused to scream. The figure in the raincoat stood there, headless, while the sound of my own camera shutter continued to emanate from it. Click, whir, click, whir. I raised my boot and kicked the thing hard, right in the center of the yellow slicker. It didn't stumble like a person. It toppled over like a stiff board, hitting the linoleum with a wet, heavy thud. The raincoat fell open, and the smell that had been permeating the aisle suddenly intensified, a hot copper stench of blood and bile. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a ghost. It was the torso of a deer. Someone or something had severed the head and legs of a black-tailed deer, shoved the bloody trunk into a raincoat, and propped it up with a rusted mop handle jammed into the spinal column. The shutter sound stopped the instant it hit the floor. Silence rushed back into the store, heavier than before. I backed away, wiping my mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. My mind was racing, trying to assemble the puzzle pieces. The arranged birds, the tent, the clothes outside, the deer man. It was all a display. It was art. Sick, twisted art. But where did the sound come from? A deer carcass can't make camera noises. I swept my flashlight beam up. Above the aisle where the figure had stood, a rusted ventilation grate hung loose from the ceiling, dark, dusty, and open. The sound hadn't come from the figure. It had been projected from the vent. Ventriloquism. I was being toyed with. I turned to run back out the front door, but a sudden irrational fear seized me. The street was wide open. If I went out there, I'd be visible from every dark window, every alleyway. I needed a defensible position. I needed to regroup. I spotted the manager's office at the back of the store, a solid oak door with a frosted glass window. I sprinted for it, slammed it shut behind me, and shoved a heavy filing cabinet against it.
I slumped against the far wall, sliding down to the floor, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I took a moment to breathe, to check my gear. My hands were shaking so bad I nearly dropped my flashlight. The office was small, windowless, and surprisingly dry. It smelled of old paper and dust. I swept my light around the room. A desk, a chair, a safe. And in the corner, a cardboard box. It was an old produce box, stamped Walla Walla onions. It was overflowing. I crawled over to it, keeping my light dim to conserve battery. I looked inside and felt the blood drain from my face. It was a collection. Wallets, dozens of them. Some were leather and cracked with age. Others were violently colorful nylon Velcro from the 90s. There were cell phones, too. Ancient Nokias, flip phones, a few cracked iPhones. I reached in and pulled out a wallet. A Washington State driver's license, Mark S., DOB 1968, expires 2005. I pulled out another, a student ID from the University of Oregon, dated 2018. This wasn't just a stash, it was a trophy room. I dug deeper, my fingers brushing against cold plastic and leather. Near the bottom, I found something that made me freeze. It was a voice recorder, an old digital Olympus model. I pressed the play button. Static hissed through the tiny speaker, then a voice cut through. It wasn't the monster's mimicry. It was a human voice, terrified and breathless. "It's in the walls," the voice whispered. "It knows my name. It sounds like my dad. Don't listen to it. If you hear someone you know, run." The recording cut out with a sharp snap. I stared at the device. It sounds like my dad. The thing in the woods had used my voice. It used the jay's call. It was a predator that didn't just hunt flesh. It hunted trust. It used familiarity as a lure. I looked at my watch. 7:45 p.m. The sun was gone. The exclusion zone was now pitch black. I was safe in the office, I told myself. The door was barricaded. I had a weapon. I could wait until morning. Then, from directly above me, the dust shifted. Thump. A heavy, deliberate footstep on the roof. Thump. Another one. It was heavy, too heavy for a man. The old ceiling tiles groaned under the weight. Dust motes danced in my flashlight beam as the footsteps moved slowly, methodically, from the front of the store towards the back, towards the office. It knew exactly where I was. The footsteps stopped directly above the center of the office. For a long, agonizing minute, nothing happened. The only movement was the dust drifting down from the acoustic ceiling tiles, swirling in the cone of my flashlight like tiny, chaotic stars. I held my breath until my chest ached, my eyes fixed on the water-stained cardboard squares above. The silence was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, expectant silence. It felt like the building itself was holding me in place, waiting for the inevitable. Then the voice came. It didn't come from the roof. It came from the ventilation grate in the corner of the office, the same duct system that had connected to the main aisle. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4, a deep, authoritative voice crackled. It sounded exactly like a sheriff's deputy. There was even the distinct burst of static and the background hum of a patrol car engine. "I've got a vehicle located near the perimeter, red Jeep, requesting a plate check." My heart leapt into my throat. A ranger. They had found my car. They were looking for me. I scrambled up, my boots skidding on the linoleum, ready to shout, to pound on the walls. "I'm in here," I wanted to scream. "In the store!" But I stopped. My hand hovered inches from the wall. The voice spoke again. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I've got a vehicle located near the perimeter, red Jeep, requesting a plate check." The intonation was identical. The pause between Jeep and requesting was the exact same length. The background static popped at the exact same millisecond. It wasn't a live person. It was a recording. I backed away from the vent, the hope draining out of me so fast it left me dizzy. That wasn't a rescue. That was a lure. The thing on the roof had heard that radio call, maybe years ago, maybe last week, and it had saved it. It was playing it back to see if I was stupid enough to respond. When I didn't answer, the strategy changed. The sheriff voice cut out with a wet, gurgling plick. A new sound filtered down through the ceiling tiles. It was a soft, high-pitched weeping, a woman's voice. "Please, please let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear." I recognized the voice. It was one of the IDs I had found in the box, a student ID, Sarah. I pressed my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. "Don't listen. It's not her. She's gone. It's just sound." Above me, the heavy weight shifted again. The ceiling tiles groaned. A fine hairline crack in the plaster of the support beam. The structure wasn't going to hold. The office wasn't a bunker anymore. It was a trap. If I stayed here, I'd be crushed, or worse, I'd be cornered in a windowless box with that thing. I looked at the barricaded door. The heavy filing cabinet I'd shoved against it seemed immovable now, but I had no choice. I grabbed the edge of the cabinet. My palms were slick with sweat. I heaved, my boots slipping on the dusty floor. It ground against the linoleum with a shriek that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Above me, the weeping stopped instantly. The thing knew I was moving. Crack! A ceiling tile directly over the desk punched inward. Debris rained down. Insulation, rat droppings, and rot. Through the hole, a limb shot down. It wasn't a paw, it wasn't a hand. It was long, pale, and multi-jointed, ending in thick black talons that hooked into the metal of the desk. The skin looked wet, translucent, like a salamander's underbelly. I screamed. I couldn't help it. The adrenaline hit me like a physical blow. I threw my entire body weight against the filing cabinet, shoving it aside just enough to squeeze through. I burst out of the office and into the main store aisle. The darkness of the store was absolute, save for the erratic beam of my flashlight as I sprinted. I didn't look back at the office. I heard the ceiling finally give way completely, a massive crash of timber and acoustic tile that shook the floorboards beneath my feet. I tore down the aisle, knocking over a display of canned peaches, slipping on the rolling cans, scrambling back up. The front door was 50 feet away, 40, 30. From the office behind me came a sound that I will never forget as long as I live. It wasn't a roar. It was a cacophony. It was the sound of a dozen voices screaming at once, men, women, children, the static of radios, the bark of dogs, all layered over each other in a deafening, discordant, chaotic loop. It was the sound of a living hard drive crashing. I hit the front door with my shoulder, bursting out onto the street. The cool night air hit my face, but it brought no relief. I stumbled into the middle of the road, spinning around, raising my flashlight towards the general store. The doorway was empty, but the screaming hadn't stopped. It was coming from inside, getting louder, getting closer. And then I saw the second movement. To my left, on the roof of the old hardware store across the street. To my right, perched on the rusted shell of the gas station awning. Silhouettes. Long, gaunt shapes crouching against the night sky. There wasn't just one of them.
The street wasn't a road anymore. It was a gauntlet. For a second, I just stood there, paralyzed by the sheer scale of it. The silhouette on the hardware store roof shifted, crouching lower, its limbs folding at impossible angles like a spider preparing to pounce. The one on the gas station awning let out a sound that hit me in the chest like a physical blow. Not a scream, but the deep, resonant whoop-whoop of a police siren. It was mocking me. They all were. The cacophony from the general store behind me erupted again, that chaotic loop of screaming voices and radio static, and that broke my paralysis. I couldn't go back the way I came. The sheriff mimic was blocking my retreat to the fence. My only option was to push deeper into Blackwood Creek, toward the dense industrial zone on the north side, and hope I could circle back to the logging road through the timber yard. I took off running. My boots slammed against the cracked asphalt, the sound echoing off the brick facades. I didn't look up at the roofs. I didn't want to know if they were keeping pace. I just fixed my eyes on the end of the street, where the town dissolved into a wall of fog and Douglas firs. But as I passed the alleyway between the post office and the barber shop, I saw movement.
Something pale and fast shot across the gap. It moved on all fours, its spine arching high, its movements jerky and frantic like a stop-motion animation. It wasn't chasing me. It was flanking me. I pushed harder, my lungs burning, the cold air tasting like iron in my throat. "Help me! Someone, please!" The voice came from directly ahead of me. It was a child's voice, a little girl. It sounded wet, desperate, and it was coming from the playground of the old elementary school on my left. I faltered, just for a microsecond. It's hardwired into us, right? You hear a kid screaming, your brain screams, "Go help." But then the voice glitched. "Help me! Someone, please!" It stuttered like a scratched CD, the pitch dropping into a guttural growl on the last syllable. It wasn't a plea, it was a lure. They were trying to slow me down, to make me hesitate. I didn't stop. I sprinted past the rusted swing set, past the jungle gym that looked like a skeletal rib cage in the moonlight. I aimed for the school building itself. It was a massive 2-story brick structure, solid, defensible. If I could get inside, maybe I could find a boiler room, a heavy door, something steel. I reached the double doors of the main entrance. Locked, chained from the inside. Panic flared. I could hear them behind me now, the wet slap of bare flesh on pavement. Not one set of footsteps, dozens. I ran around the side of the building toward the gymnasium entrance. I didn't bother checking the handle. I raised my boot and kicked the glass pane next to the crash bar. It shattered with a deafening crash. I reached through, jagged shards slicing into my jacket sleeve, and shoved the bar. The door groaned and swung open. I threw myself inside, landing hard on the polished wood of the basketball court. I scrambled up, grabbed a heavy wooden bench from the sidelines, and jammed it against the door. It wasn't much, but it would buy me seconds. I backed away into the center of the gym. It was cavernous, smelling of old varnish and stale sweat. Moonlight streamed in through the high, wire-meshed windows, painting the floor in stripes of silver and black. "Okay," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Okay, think." The noise outside had stopped. The sirens, the screaming, the radio static, it all cut out the moment I entered the building. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. I spun around, aiming my flashlight at the shadows in the bleachers, the dark maw of the locker room tunnel. Nothing, just dust motes dancing in the beam. Why had they stopped? I walked toward the center circle, trying to control my breathing. I needed to find a way out the back toward the timber yard. I couldn't stay here. This was a fishbowl. Then the PA system crackled. The speakers were mounted high in the rafters, rusted cages of wire. A burst of white noise filled the gym, loud enough to make me wince. Then a voice. "Attention, students," a woman's voice droned. It was monotone, devoid of emotion. "Please proceed to the assembly hall immediately. Do not run, do not scream." My blood froze. The electricity in this town had been dead for 40 years. There was no power, there was no generator. The creatures weren't just mimicking voices, they were mimicking systems. They were conducting electricity, or they were in the walls. The speaker crackled again. "I see you," the voice said, but it wasn't the woman anymore. It was me. It was a recording of me from earlier that day when I was talking to myself on the hike in. "I see you," my voice repeated from the rafters. "Center court, Canon R5, blue jacket." They weren't outside. They hadn't stopped chasing me. I looked up at the high windows. Shadowy shapes were pressing against the wire mesh, blocking out the moon. But the voice was coming from the locker room tunnel. They herded me. They wanted me in here. I didn't wait for the voice to finish its taunt. The second my own voice echoed from the rafters, "Center court, Canon R5, I bolted. The locker room tunnel was a gaping black maw to my left, pulsing with that heavy, wet silence. I wasn't going anywhere near it. Instead, I sprinted toward the far end of the gymnasium, aiming for the double doors marked emergency exit in faded red paint. Behind me, the PA system shrieked, a high-pitched burst of feedback that dissolved into a guttural, wet laughter. It sounded like a drain backing up. I hit the crash bar on the exit doors with my full weight. Clang! They didn't budge. I slammed against them again, shouting in frustration. Heavy chains had been wound through the handles on the outside. This wasn't just a trap, it was a premeditated slaughtering pen. They had sealed the perimeter and left the main entrance as the funnel. I spun around, back to the doors, my flashlight sweeping the gym. The laughter from the speakers died abruptly. In the sudden silence, I heard the sound of footsteps. Not the heavy, boot-like thuds from the roof earlier. These were soft. Slap, 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 like wet meat hitting the polished wood floor. Something was emerging from the locker room tunnel. I raised my camera. It was instinct. Maybe I thought I could document my own death. Maybe I just needed to put a lens between me and the horror to disassociate. Through the viewfinder, I saw it. It was tall, easily 7 feet, but it was hunched over, its spine curved in a sickly question mark. It was pale, the color of a maggot, and completely hairless. Its limbs were too long, dragging on the floor, the knuckles swollen and bruised. But it was the head that made me almost drop the camera. It didn't have a face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, pale surface of taut skin where features should have been. But in the center of its throat, right where the Adam's apple would be, there was a slit, a vertical gash that pulsed and fluttered. As I watched, the slit vibrated. "Focus," it said. It was my voice, again, perfect clarity. It was mocking me. The creature took a step onto the court, then another. It moved with a jerky, twitching rhythm, like a video buffering. I looked up at the bleachers. The shadows I had seen earlier were descending now, 3 more of them crawling down the wooden seats like massive, pale insects. They weren't rushing. They were taking their positions. I was cornered. My flashlight beam was trembling so bad the light was dancing all over the creature's chest. I needed a distraction. I needed a weapon. I looked down at my camera. The Canon R5. I had a speed light flash on the hot shoe, a high-intensity strobe. The creature in the center, the alpha, tilted its faceless head. It let out a sound like a camera shutter winding. Whirr. It was waiting for me to take the picture. "You want a shot?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "Here." I cranked the flash output to maximum, 1:1, full intensity. I didn't frame the shot. I just pointed the lens directly at the thing's face and mashed the shutter button. Pop! The explosion of white light was blinding in the dark gym. The creature screamed. It wasn't a mimicry this time. It was a raw biological sound, a high-pitched shriek of pain that shattered the air. It stumbled back, its long hands flying up to cover its faceless head, as if the light physically burned it. The other 3 on the bleachers hissed, a sound like pressurized steam, and scrambled back into the shadows. They were sensitive to light, photosensitive. Living in the dark mines for 40 years had made them vulnerable. I didn't hesitate. While the alpha was writhing, thrashing its limbs against the floorboards, I ran. Not toward the chained exit, but to the only other door in the room, the coach's office, a small glass-walled box near the bleachers. I threw myself at the door. Locked. I swung my heavy camera body like a hammer, smashing the glass pane. I reached in, turned the deadbolt, and fell inside. I slammed the door and locked it, knowing it wouldn't hold them long. I scanned the tiny room, a desk, a rusted whistle on a lanyard, a filing cabinet, and a window. A small, reinforced window looking out into the alleyway behind the school. I grabbed the filing cabinet and tipped it over, ramming it against the office door just as the first heavy blow struck the wood from the outside. Boom! The door buckled. The alpha was recovering. I grabbed a metal trophy from the desk, 1982 regional champions, and started hammering at the window latch. It was rusted shut. Boom! Wood splintered. A pale, multi-jointed hand shot through the gap in the door, blindly groping for the lock. I smashed the trophy against the glass. It spiderwebbed but didn't break. It was wire-reinforced safety glass. "Come on!" I screamed, hammering it again. Boom! The doorframe gave way. The filing cabinet slid back inches. Through the gap, I saw the alpha's chest, the pulsing slit in its throat. It spoke again, but this time it wasn't my voice. It was a sound I knew well. It was the sound of my Jeep's engine starting. Vroom, vroom. It was telling me there was no escape. The sound of my Jeep's engine revving inside that tiny glass-walled office was the most terrifying thing I have ever heard. It wasn't just a recording, it was a promise. It was the Alpha telling me, in the language of my own salvation, that it had already won. Room, room. The engine noise vibrated in the Alpha's throat, deep and guttural, shaking the very air in the room. The filing cabinet I jammed against the door screeched across the linoleum as the creature shoved it aside with impossible strength. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have a knife. I had a Canon R5 and a speedlight. The door frame splintered with a wet crack, and the Alpha squeezed its upper body into the room. Up close, the smell was atrocious, a concentrated stench of ammonia and old blood. Its faceless head swiveled toward me, the vertical slit in its throat pulsating as it switched from the Jeep sound to a low, static hiss. It reached for me. Its fingers were sickeningly long, the joints swollen like knots in a rope. I didn't think, I just reacted. I slammed my thumb against the flash settings wheel, spinning it to stroboscopic mode. I pointed the lens directly at the slit in its throat, right where a face should be, and held down the shutter release. Pop, 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 pop. The room erupted in a chaotic, blinding seizure of white light. The strobe fired 10 seconds a second, turning the small office into a disorienting nightmare of frozen frames. In the first flash, I saw the creature's skin recoil, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. In the second, I saw the slit in its throat snap shut tight. In the third, I saw it throw its hands up, screeching, a sound that wasn't mimicked, but raw, biological agony. The light was hurting it, physically hurting it. The pale skin blistered where the high-intensity beams hit, smoking like it was being touched by a soldering iron. I didn't let up. I kept the shutter held down, the strobe flashing rhythmically, creating a wall of light between me and the monster. It thrashed backward, crashing into the filing cabinet, disoriented and blinded. I spun around to the window. The latch was still jammed. The wire-reinforced glass was spiderwebbed, but intact. I grabbed the heavy metal trophy again. I didn't aim for the glass this time. I aimed for the rusted iron handle of the locking mechanism. Wham! The metal groaned. Behind me, the Alpha was recovering, its screeching turning into a low, murderous growl. Wham! The handle sheared off. The window swung outward, squealing on its hinges. I didn't look back. I dove headfirst through the opening, tumbling out into the alleyway behind the school. I hit the wet asphalt hard, rolling to absorb the impact, my camera slamming into my ribs. Pain flared in my shoulder, but I scrambled up, ignoring it. I was outside. The air was cold and thick with fog. To my left, the alley led back toward the main street, the kill zone. To my right, a chain-link fence separated the school grounds from the industrial sector, the old sawmill and the timber yard. The timber yard led to the logging road. The logging road led to my Jeep. I ran right. I could hear them behind me now, not just the Alpha in the office, but the others, the ones from the roof, the ones from the bleachers. They were communicating, a chorus of clicks and stolen voices echoing off the brick walls of the school. "Wait! Stop! I'm hurt!" a woman's voice cried out from the roof. "Officer down! Officer down!" the sheriff's voice bellowed from the alley mouth. They were throwing everything they had at me, trying to trigger a hesitation, a look back. I scrambled up the chain-link fence, the metal rattling loudly in the silence. I vaulted over the top, catching my pants on the wire, ripping free as I dropped into the sawdust and mud of the timber yard. This place was a graveyard of massive machinery, rusted conveyor belts, towering stacks of rotting lumber, and the skeletal remains of cranes loomed in the fog like iron dinosaurs. It was a maze. I kept my flashlight off. I couldn't risk giving away my position again. I navigated by the faint silvery moonlight filtering through the fog, moving as fast as I dared through the shadows of the woodpiles. I was making good time. I could see the tree line ahead, the border where the industrial zone ended and the deep forest began. The logging road was right there. But as I rounded a stack of cedar planks, I stopped dead. The sounds behind me had ceased. The mimicking, the screaming, the footsteps, all of it had just cut out. The silence was back, that heavy, pressurized silence from the hike-in. I stood there, chest heaving, listening. And then, from the darkness of the tree line ahead of me, directly between me and my escape route, a light flickered on. It wasn't a flashlight. It wasn't the moon. It was a pair of headlights. My Jeep was parked at the edge of the timber yard, facing me. Its engine was idling. The driver's side door opened. I stood frozen in the mud, the cold mist swirling around my knees, staring at the impossible. It was my Jeep. There was no doubt about it. The dent on the front bumper from a parking garage in Seattle, the sticker on the windshield from a trip to Acadia,
It was my car, and it was running. The headlights cut twin cones through the fog, illuminating the drifting sawdust like snow. The driver's side door hung open. Slowly, agonizingly, a leg emerged. It wasn't wearing a boot. It was a bare, pale foot, long and flat, with toes that gripped the metal running board like talons. Then came the leg, wrapped in a pair of shredded denim jeans that I recognized immediately. They belonged to the student ID I'd found in the box. Mark. The figure unfolded itself from the driver's seat. It was tall, impossibly tall, and thin. It wore a grotesque collage of stolen clothing, Mark's jeans, a red flannel shirt that was bursting at the seams, and a ranger's wide-brimmed hat pulled low over its face. It stood by the open door, one hand resting on the roof of the car, mimicking a casual stance. If you were 50 yards away, squinting through the fog, you might think it was a person. You might think it was help. But I was 20 yards away, and I could hear the wet, sucking sound of its breathing. "Get in," it said. The voice wasn't a recording this time. It wasn't the static-filled playback of the sheriff or the looping cry of the girl. This was my voice, but it was wrong. It was flat, monotone, devoid of the tremors of fear or the rhythm of breath. It sounded like a text-to-speech program trained on my vocal cords. "Get in," it repeated, gesturing to the passenger seat with a long, multi-jointed hand. My mind reeled. They weren't just mimicking sounds anymore. They were mimicking behavior. They had watched people drive. They had watched people offer rides. They found my spare key in the magnetic box under the wheel well, a trick every hiker knows, and apparently, so did they. They didn't just want to kill me. They wanted to leave. They wanted to take the car past the perimeter fence. A twig snapped behind me. I didn't turn, but I knew the others were there. The alpha from the gym, the ones from the roof. They had formed a semicircle, herding me toward the vehicle. They wanted me in the car. Maybe they needed a live driver to get through the checkpoint. Maybe they just wanted to finish playing with their food. I looked at the creature by the door. It was blocking my only exit. The timber yard was a dead end behind me. The forest was an impenetrable wall on either side. I had the bear spray in my left hand, the camera with the strobe in my right. "No," I whispered. The creature tilted its head, the ranger hat slipping slightly. Underneath, in the glare of the headlights, I saw the smooth, faceless skin and the vertical slit of a mouth. The slit widened. A sound came out, not a voice, but a low, vibrating hum, the sound of a high-tension wire snapping. It lunged. It moved faster than anything organic should. 1 second it was by the door, the next it was on top of me. I brought the camera up, jamming my thumb onto the shutter button. Pop, pop, pop. The strobe fired, blindingly bright in the fog. The creature shrieked, that same raw, biological scream of pain, and recoiled, throwing its hands up to cover its face. The light seared its sensitive skin, buying me a fraction of a second. I dropped the camera. It hit the mud with a sickening crack, but I didn't care. I grabbed the bear spray with both hands, ripped the safety pin out with my teeth, and sprayed a thick orange cloud directly into the vertical slit in its throat. The sound it made was indescribable. It was the sound of air being forced through wet meat. It thrashed backward, clawing at its throat, colliding with the side of the Jeep. The impact left a massive dent in the door panel. "Run!" I screamed at myself. "Move!" I didn't go for the passenger side. I dove for the driver's seat. I scrambled over the center console, kicking the creature in the chest as it tried to grab my ankle. Its skin felt cold and rubbery like a dead fish. I slammed the door shut and locked it. The interior was warm. The heater was blasting. The smell was overpowering. Musk, rot, and pine needles. I looked at the ignition. The keys were there, dangling, swaying from the commotion. I grabbed the gear shift. Thud! A heavy weight landed on the roof. Smash! A fist shattered the passenger side window. A pale arm shot in, raking blindly for me. I slammed the Jeep into drive and floored it. The tires spun in the mud, slinging sludge everywhere, and then caught traction.
The Jeep lurched forward, fishtailing wildly. I clipped the woodpile, sending logs cascading down behind me, blocking the path for the others. The thing on the roof howled, a sound that vibrated through the metal ceiling right into my skull. I wasn't safe yet. I was in a metal box doing 60 miles an hour down a rotting logging road with a monster on the roof and an army of them behind me. And the fence was still 3 miles away.
The Jeep screamed down the logging road, the suspension bottoming out with every pothole, shaking my teeth in my skull. I didn't look at the speedometer. I didn't look at the fuel gauge. My entire world had narrowed to the cone of my high beams cutting through the fog and the violent, rhythmic thud crunch on the roof directly above my head. It was trying to peel the metal back. The thing wasn't just holding on, it was digging in. I could hear the sheet metal tearing, a high-pitched screech that harmonized with the engine's roar. A pale, multi-jointed hand smashed through the driver's side window, which I had thought was safe, spraying safety glass into my lap. I swerved hard to the left, aiming for a thick cluster of hemlocks, hoping to scrape the thing off. Branches whipped against the side of the Jeep, exploding into pine needles, but the weight on the roof didn't shift. The hand flailed blindly inside the cabin, grasping for the steering wheel. From my throat, it brushed my ear, and the skin felt freezing cold, like a bag of ice. Then it spoke. Right in my ear, over the roar of the wind and the engine, it whispered, "Don't leave me. I'm scared. Please don't leave me." It was my mother's voice. She's been dead for 5 years. Tears blurred my vision, not from sadness, but from pure, unadulterated terror. It was digging into my memories, pulling out the sounds that would make a human being hesitate. It was weaponizing my grief. I screamed, a raw, wordless sound, and slammed the accelerator to the floor. "Shut up! Shut up!" The perimeter fence was coming up. I recognized the landmark, the rotting way station shack where I'd found the bucket of birds. The gate was ahead. It was a heavy chain-link barrier, reinforced with steel pipe. I wasn't going to stop to open it. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles turned white. The creature on the roof seemed to sense what I was doing. The weight shifted. The hand withdrew from the window. It began to pound on the roof with both fists, a frantic, desperate drumming. Wham! 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 It mimicked the sound of a police siren again. Whoop, 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 trying to command me to pull over. I locked my elbows. "Not today," I hissed. I hit the gate doing 50 miles an hour. The impact was explosive. The airbag didn't deploy, the sensor must have been dead or the angle was wrong, but the seatbelt locked, bruising my ribs. The chain link shrieked as it tore from the posts, wrapping around the front grille like a metallic net. The windshield spiderwebbed instantly, turning the world into a fractured mosaic of gray and black. The Jeep bucked violently, the rear end fishtailing, and for a terrifying second I thought I was going to flip. But the heavy tires found purchase on the gravel of the public access road. I felt a massive weight dislodge from the roof. I looked in the rearview mirror. Through the cracked glass and the drifting dust, I saw it. The creature was tumbling in the dirt, limbs flailing like a rag doll. It rolled to a stop right at the threshold of the broken gate. I didn't slow down. I kept driving, but I watched it. It stood up, slowly, unfolding those impossible limbs. It stood right on the line where the forest ended and the public road began. It didn't cross. It just stood there, a pale silhouette against the dark trees, watching me go. As I rounded the bend that would take me out of sight, I saw the others, dozens of them, emerging from the tree line like white ghosts gathering around the gate. They weren't chasing, they were just observing. I drove for 2 hours before I saw the lights of a gas station. I didn't stop there. I didn't stop until I was back in my driveway in Seattle, shaking so hard I couldn't get the key out of the ignition. That was 3 weeks ago. I reported the vandalism to the car insurance company, told them I hit a deer. They totaled the Jeep. The roof looked like it had been put through a hydraulic press. I didn't tell the police. I didn't tell the rangers. Who would believe me? I left my camera in the mud at the timber yard, the SD card with the audio of the mimic, the photos of the deer man, the footage of the tent. It's all gone.
All I have is my word and the nightmares. But here's the thing. Here's why I'm writing this. I live in the city now. It's loud. Sirens, traffic, people. It should be safe. But last night, I was lying in bed, trying to sleep. My apartment is on the 4th floor. The window was cracked open to let in the cool air. From the alleyway below, I heard a sound. It was a bird, a jay. Squawk! Squawk! It was normal at first, but then the rhythm changed. It became a loop, a perfect digital repetition. Squawk! 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 And then a voice, soft, scratchy. Hello? Is anyone there? It was my voice, the voice from the woods. I slammed the window shut and locked it. I haven't been outside since. They know where I live, or maybe they never really stopped following me. If you hear a voice in the woods that you know, run. If you hear your own voice calling for help, don't answer. And for the love of God, stay away from Blackwood Creek.